Is everyone ready? Then I'll start my time on my first word. Stephen Hawking. Of consistent, unconditional payments distributed by the government to ensure a basic standard of living for every member of the community. In light of these definitions, here's our framework. The resolution should be evaluated by weighing the policy's advantages against its disadvantages. The ballot should be cast for the side that provides the highest net positive impact. In this first speech, I'll present 4 arguments. 1. AI breaks the labor economy. That's the problem. 2. UBI mitigates job loss. That's the solution. The next 2 are unique advantages. 3. UBI fights poverty. And 4. UBI promotes economic investment. So with that, let's get into contention 1. AI breaks the labor economy. To understand why action is necessary, we must first recognize that AI is fundamentally transforming the labor market, placing an unprecedented number of jobs at risk. Research from Alondu et al. In 2024 estimates that around 42% of current jobs are potentially exposed to AI. This risk is not marginal, as Goldman Sachs economist Briggs and Kodani 2023 write, around the world, shifts in workflows triggered by these advances could expose over 300 million full-time jobs to automation. Though these estimates vary, this impact is a historic level of disruption. Moreover, low-skilled workers are at the greatest risk. As AI replaces routine tasks, displaced workers are often pushed into lower-paying, less stable jobs. In short, AI-driven automation is displacing jobs and leaving lower-income workers behind at an astronomical rate. This extraordinary disruption calls for an expansive solution. That's why in the last few years, UBI has gained remarkable attention. The reason is simple. It works. 2. UBI mitigates job loss. Here's how UBI combats job loss from AI automation. UBI reduces the pressure to accept low-wage work, preventing the downward spiral of income inequality. In addition, a meta-analysis done by De Paz Gañez et al. 2020 finds that a UBI increases workers' ability to negotiate better conditions, improving the lowest quality jobs in the market. At the same time, UBI gives workers the flexibility to adapt rather than settle. McKinsey Global Institute 2020 explains that a UBI enables individuals to focus on skill development and retraining. Supporting this, an open research study done in 2025 finds that low household income recipients were, on average, 25% more likely than control counterparts to plan for their educational attainment and 34% more likely to have participated in education or job training. Overall, here's the impact. 1, people don't have to take the lowest paying jobs. 2, they can negotiate for better jobs. And 3, they're free to pursue education for higher paying jobs. A host of studies confirms it works. The proven track record of UBI alone is reason enough to affirm the resolution, but our next 2 arguments add key advantages that make UBI a compelling policy decision. 3, UBI fights poverty better than traditional welfare. UBI provides a consistent income floor, ensuring individuals can meet their basic needs regardless of situation or employment status. This matters because poverty is not simply a lack of income. UBI creates a mechanism for stable investment and savings. Research from the Stanford Basic Income Lab supports this, as Hasdell 2020 explains. Findings are generally positive that UBI-type programs alleviate poverty and improve health and education outcomes, and that the effects on the labor market participation are minimal. Additionally, according to a report co-authored by a University of York academic, a new UBI model could cut poverty by more than half at no net cost, reducing to its lowest level in 60 years. In the model, compared to the current system, working age poverty falls by over 25% and child poverty falls by more than half. The impact is transformative, large-scale results. People are lifted out of poverty. Our final argument is another advantage. 4. UBI promotes economic investment. You might imagine that a UBI removes the incentive to work. However, the opposite is true. UBI translates directly into real-world entrepreneurship. An open research study done in 2025 finds that by the third year, Black recipients were about 26% more likely to start or help start a business compared to the control group. And similarly, female recipients saw a 15% rise relative to the control average. This shows that with basic financial security, individuals are more willing and able to take risks, create businesses, and contribute to economic dynamicism. The impact is freedom and economic boon. People are free to innovate and invest in our future. For all these reasons, my partner and I are proud to affirm the resolution. I now stand open for cross-examination.
All right, so I first want to ask about the unprecedented job risk. Have there been signs where the significant push towards eliminating these jobs has shown a decreased efficiency in the economy in certain aspects?
Right, so job loss, as we're arguing, is going to damage the economy significantly.
Okay, and you also bring up the idea of U.S. and just it preventing income inequality. So how much money would the UBI give to individuals? Is there a ballpark amount?
Right, so there's no ballpark amount because the resolution says society, so the amount of money that the UBI would be giving recipients would vary upon the society based on their society's needs.
So it could be somewhere between $1 and $100,000, but we don't have to figure out the number right now?
Within a reasonable amount, but yes.
What would a reasonable amount be?
I don't have to define that as the affirmative because society does not refer to one society. Giving somebody $1 in Kenya versus $1 in the United States has radically different implications.
Okay. And you, I guess I want to talk about, is there a way we can talk about how it would be funded per se?
As the affirmative, because we are not providing a plan to implement this in a specific society, we do not have to provide a funding mechanism because this would vary upon the society being used.
Okay. And you bring up this idea of how, in the third point, how UBI fights poverty and bring up how it's better than welfare.
Yes.
So would that mean that we wouldn't have a need for welfare anymore, or would we just, the UBI would solve that problem better?
Right, so we're not going to argue here that UBI and traditional welfare are mutually exclusive. There's nothing in the resolution that states that traditional welfare programs would have to be eliminated. We can keep those in implementation and use a UBI to supplement those.
Okay. And the idea of promoting economic investment, could you expand a bit further upon how this would increase economic investment?
Right, so in case, I kind of give two highlights to this. The first is the increase in education attainment and training opportunities. So we see that under UBI frameworks, people are more likely than control people who do not receive these payments to get educational attainment, pushing them to higher quality jobs. And then the second thing that we see is entrepreneurship. People who receive UBI are more likely to start their own businesses. And not only does this contribute to the economy, it contributes to their general flourishing as they're able to express themselves.
And does this, in the long term, solve the issue of AI overtaking more and more jobs as the days go on?
Right, so I would argue that no policy solution is going to tackle an issue in the long run permanently and completely. However, we're seeing that people that receive a UBI are better off than people who do not receive a UBI. It's a step in the right direction.
Okay. And so for the idea of the UBI mitigating job loss, could you further expand upon, the income inequality aspect of it? It's just if we don't have to know exactly how much money it would give, how can we estimate the idea of how drastic the income inequality would change?
Right, so we're not able to say income inequality is going to reduce by X% because this varies upon society. But if we look at various case studies that are done, for example, in Kenya, the people that received a UBI were lifted out of poverty as compared to control groups.
Could you explain a bit more about that Kenyan study?
Right, so in Kenya, people were receiving a UBI, and we see that in that study, people, obviously they have more money to spend, but we see that consumer spending like in unnecessary aspects reduced, but like they've used the UBI to improve their conditions.
All right. Oh yeah.
Run ready. Time will start on my first word in 3, 2, 1. In this first negative speech, I will present 4 objections to implementing a UBI. First, UBI is in search of a problem that doesn't exist. Job displacement by AI is hyped up and in fact not even a problem. A January 7th report by Oxford Economics noted that job loss due to AI during 2025 represented 4.5% of the total losses. To illustrate how insignificant that is, Oxford Economics stated that in a typical month, 1.5 to 1.8 million jobs are lost for reasons other than AI. Oxford Economics said it doubts unemployment rates will be pushed materially higher by AI in the next few years. Another research report released by Gartner on February 3rd pointed out that companies in 2027 will begin rehiring 50% of the workers who they laid off because AI capabilities don't match AI's promises. Gartner says companies are rehiring those workers. Starting in 2028, Gartner predicts AI will create more jobs than it destroys. As for small businesses, who are the greatest job creators in the economy, a new study by Gusto analyzing hiring data from 7,700 small firms concluded AI is increasing jobs. The report found, quote, small businesses with more AI-exposed workforces are seeing revenue and hiring gains, not the dramatic job losses that have been predicted. Fears about AI causing mass unemployment in the foreseeable future are alarmist and wrong. Andy Kessler, a Wall Street Journal columnist, wrote in February 23rd that technology may kill old jobs, but then voila, it creates new ones. Kessler argued that to ignore AI hysterics and mass unemployment claims because they're ignorant, nearsighted snapshots. Our second argument is that UBI is unproven and likely a poor solution to AI job displacement. UBI pilot experiments that have been tried in Finland, in countries like the affirmative mentioned, Kenya, and other countries show, according to Lance Robert, chief investment strategist at RIA, did not translate into higher employment, improved skills, or long-term income growth. Another UBI experiment funded by Sam Altman, an AI enthusiast, produced dismal results. The study conducted by Open Research provided $1,000 a month to 1,000 low-income individuals for 3 years, with a control group receiving $50. Ryan Bourne of the Cato Institute reported in 2025 that a study found that recipients on average banked the extra cash, and there was little evidence that they attempted to find better jobs, invest in education, or start a business. In fact, the study found recipients reduced their work time by 4 to 5%. Our third argument is that implementing UBI will destroy the economy. Cynthia Usland, an NYU professor, noted in 2019 that for UBI to be successful in solving for job displacement by AI, the UBI would need to provide recipients with at least $1,000 per month in cash payment. Berkeley professor Hilary Hoynes and Jeffrey Rothstein estimate that providing this amount to all residents over 18 would cost $3 trillion. The amount is equivalent to 43% of the $7 trillion federal budget. Needless to say, coming up with $3 trillion is a Herculean task. To pay for a UBI, the notion that there would be political support for replacing any existing welfare program is far-fetched. But if this approach were tried, reports from the OECD and American Enterprise says that the replacement would be highly disruptive and maybe even increase poverty. Deficit spending is hardly a wise option, given the current deficit is now $37 trillion. Mark Penn, CEO of Stagewell, argued in 2023 that further government debt expansion is a power keg that would implode the economy. So that leaves massive tax increase as the only option. However, this will harm the economy, undermining the goals of the affirmative. In 2021, an empirical study by Audrey Doherty Liu of the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland modeled the impact of a $12,000 annual UBI, assuming that it would require a tax rate increase of 22.3% to remain revenue neutral. The author concluded that the aggregate response of the economy is a contraction of both capital and output. Another possible blow to the economy is creating inflation. Stephanie Lasso, risk management expert, argued in 2023 that if UBI injected trillions of dollars into the economy, inflation might possibly be a problem, and it could erode the benefit of implementing a UBI in essentially just a few years. Our fourth argument is to advocate a counterplan. The United States federal government should increase by 100% the amount of tax deductions companies can claim if they reskill workers. Alex Masu, senior policy analyst at the Tax Foundation, says raising the cap would make it easier for companies to retain workers for new roles and technology replaces them in their current ones. The negative counterplan avoids harming the economy and it solves better for implementing a UBI. Peter Marlowe of the University of Canberra argued in 2026 that the most effective response to AI job displacement is targeted technical upskilling. Moreover, they argue the policy mixes that primarily relies on cash flows risk delaying rather than mitigating employment re-equilibrium in the age of AI. Thus, we support the plan to our counterplan and reject the affirmative plan. Thank you.
So your first contention is that AI automation is overstated. However, considering 23.5% of companies have already reduced people with AI, how is this number insignificant?
So the reason why it's insignificant is because you have to look at that in comparison to how many jobs are lost on any given month. So yes, you're saying 23 point, I forget the exact number of companies are impacted, but in the grand scheme of how many people lose their job on a monthly basis, we see that represents only 4.5%. So the issue is overstated when looking at all unemployment rates on a monthly basis.
Okay, right. So just because people as a whole aren't losing as many jobs as they could be losing, wouldn't you argue that we should take a solution to help combat the people that are losing the jobs?
Well, we did provide a solution. That is our counter plan. What we're saying is that the affirmative plan is actually going to be very detrimental for the reasons I outlined and does not solve. It is a wrong solution because of all of the underlying impacts. We agree that AI job displacement is an issue, which is why we presented our counter plan, and we believe it is a better fit to address that issue that we think is very real and will help workers more intrinsically than a UBI.
Right. Isn't it counterintuitive, though, to say that AI automation isn't a problem and then to propose a counter plan to combat AI automation?
So what we're saying is two things. Two things can be true at once. First, we can agree that AI is a problem, not overstatedly a problem in the way that requires the drastic solution the affirmative presented, but also it's a problem that has a tangible solution that we can have right now, which is reskilling, which better helps employees sort of get better jobs, intrinsically get more value, and to protect their livelihood. What you're doing is to provide is smashing the entire house down or burning the entire house down because you don't like the color of the curtains.
Okay, so let's move on to your contention 3 on destroying the economy.
Yes.
So you talk about the replacement of welfare programs. Why are UBI programs and traditional welfare programs mutually exclusive?
Wait, sorry, rephrase your question.
So you say that if we had a UBI, we would be replacing welfare programs
We
that
didn't say
are
it
already...
would be replacing welfare programs.
Right, so then can you explain the idea of the decrease in welfare?
Yeah, so what we're saying is, the problem with the affirmative is that they say it's just a UBI in general, they're not sticking to a country. It is hard to understand, economically speaking, how it impacts nations. What we do is show you one example, which is the current nation we're in, the United States. How would a UBI be implemented economically? We provide you that model, and we show that would require $3 trillion, almost half of the federal budget. With that amount of money, there's only 3 options that we set for funding mechanism, which they don't provide. All of those options have detrimental results, which will negatively impact people in poverty and the American economy overall, and harm the people that the app cares about.
All right, so then in your counterclaim, you say the United States federal government should, but this resolution that we're debating today says society. If we wanted a United States-centric debate, would the resolution not specify that?
Okay, so here, this is going back to the issue that we talked about. The reason why you want to pick a specific nation, where if you want to propose a different nation, the reason why you want to have specific nation rather than general is we need to understand technically how the UBI is going to be implemented. Sure, you want to implement an UBI in Kenya or in European countries. Yes, we'd happily debate you on those issues, but we don't have a mechanism as to how it would be implemented. We don't have economic models for like showing the benefits. They're pulling and choosing different models that have drastically different underlying assumptions, which is why you shouldn't support that and support a specific centric one. Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
Time now. I think this is perfect.
All right. I'm the second affirmative speaker in today's debate. My name is Jack, and I have 6 minutes on my timer if my opponents are ready. My partner is ready. My judge is ready.
Always
ready. In this speech, I'm going to be addressing my opponent's 4 main contentions and then refuting the attacks on our case of time lapse. So first of all, they say that UBI helps a problem that doesn't exist. My partner aptly pointed out in cross-examination that they, on their 4th point, admit the problem does exist. So immediately, this 1st point is called into contention. They then backtrack by saying that the scale is simply what they're arguing. Well, if the scale is simply what they're arguing, then the rhetoric they extort in their very first contention about how AI overtaking and job loss is not a problem in general does not make sense to the magnitude even they're talking about. So their 1st and 4th contention are in direct contradiction to one another, talking about in the 4th, it's a serious problem that they provide a counterclaim for, and in the 1st, it's not a problem at all, and they say my side is immediately overreacting. So I would just like to call that contradiction into play. Next, I would like to point out that AI automation for the job market is in fact a problem. As we cited on case in our very first contention, we talked about how 300 million jobs are at risk due to AI automation. That is far outside the scale that my opponents would say is just normal circulation of the labor economy, and they failed to address this number in their last speech. I would also like to say another Goldman Sachs study points out that 16,000 jobs a month are being lost directly due to AI automation. They say that this is just the general circulation of the market, and we don't know why some of these jobs are being lost. Well, this Goldman Sachs study I'm citing states directly that 16,000 jobs a month are being lost directly due to AI automation. This is a direct threat and brings up and supports all the harms that my partner talked about in our 1st and 2nd contentions. We see that this 16,000 jobs lost a month is only going to increase with the 300 million more at risk, saying that this problem is very real, very tangible, it's happening right now, and it needs to be addressed with measures that are actually going to combat it, like a UBI bill brought up by my partner's 2nd contention. Moving on, they say that UBI is unproven and it is not a good solution. I would like to bring up, they only use 1 case study in this example, or 2 case studies. They use the United States very specifically for their 2nd and 4th points, and they use the other study, the Finnish study or the Netherlands study, in this point right here. I'd like to bring up this quote right here. This is from a multi-study conclusion, and this talks about both the studies they talked about, but it also talks about the Kenyan, Iranian, Alaskan, and over a dozen other proposed and tested UBI programs. Now, the conclusion from this study is, quote, "Therefore, in light of the evidence we have gathered, it all shows that UBI is not only an effective instrument to reduce poverty and inequality and improve social welfare, but it is also sustainable in relation to employment. That is, it improves sustainable development and the SDGs, especially through social and economic development. What remains is to make the political decision, and once taken, decide on the best ways to implement it within the set of complementary measures that aim at the well-being of the population," end quote. That is from the University of excuse my pronunciation, from Spain. So we see that in a multi-study conclusion, they they say this is unproven. Well, I just gave them over a dozen studies proving it, to their 2 on the contrary that say that those 2 disprove it in fact. So their second point also falls flat in today's debate due to lack of evidence. They also talk about, in their first and second contention, how the creation of small businesses is what we should be focusing on in some instances and how those are flourishing. My partner brought up in her very first speech how a UBI directly promotes the creation of small businesses, specifically among minority groups and women in the workforce. So we see that if they actually care about small business creation, they will be in favor of a UBI. So their subpoint in both the first and second contention about small business creation also flows to the affirmative side. Now, on to their third point, they talk about how it destroys the economy. Then they cite a specific example that dictates everyone needs $1,000 a month. Now, as was brought up in the very first cross-examination, we are not proposing $1,000 a month. We are not proposing any metric at all other than what will secure someone's basic standard of living. Now, as was so aptly put by my partner in cross-examination, this varies drastically from country to country. So we cannot see this case study where they say everyone must have $1,000 a month as a means to discredit the benefits that have been ill-refuted that we have talked about that a UBI can propose, where it creates new jobs, pulls people out of poverty effectively as a blanket issue, and helps them overall with their overall well-being. So we can't say that this one specific study, in contrast to the 12 and the conclusion of the 12 I just listed, actually holds weight to say that this is the failings of the affirmative argument rather than just one specific study they're citing in today's debate. So that should fall due to relevancy, following their third point. On their counterplan, I've already pointed out the contradiction between the 2 points here. They say that it is not a drastic issue, and then they say, well, in cross-examination, they agreed. In fact, they said they agreed that AI displacing workers is a problem in cross-examination. So another direct contradiction from my opponent's own words. But we see that they would not be proposing a counterplan if AI automation is not a problem. Now, what is this counterplan? Tax deductions for companies that retain workers. I have a couple of counterpoints to why this is an ineffective measure in today's society. From the Pew Research Center, we see that, quote, the cost must be paid by increasing tax rates, cutting spending, or both. Each can have negative economic consequences, end quote. So they cited all throughout their case about the disastrous economic consequences of implementing a UBI. Well, we see the exact same problem potentially occurring with their tax cut solution. That I would also like to point out, tax cut solutions for retention of workers in a variety of solutions already exist. So this is not a new idea, and this is not an effective idea in the sense that they say we need to drastically increase in this measure. I would point out that these measures exist today and have been ineffective. From the National Bureau of Economic Research, quote, a large share of program benefits accrued to firms that would have retained workers even in the absence of the credit, end quote. So we see that this tax credit is not really incentivizing anything at all. The statistics they cite about how this will help retain workers, these companies would have retained these workers regardless. And for both of these reasons, their counterplan must fall. I stand open to cross-examination.
Okay. I'm gonna go. Anyone not ready? Our time will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, first, I think I want to first ask you about this, the entire mechanism of how your plan is working. So you're saying you're just arguing for the the goodness of a UBI in general, right? And it can be implemented across different countries. There's no no specific country that you're
it must be implemented across different countries as per our definition of society.
So isn't that overburdened? Oh, how is the negative ground supposed to prepare for that if you can just have this one floating idea of a UBI but you don't even attach to a country? How are we supposed to prepare for that? Is that not going to be shouldn't that be strike down the grounds of fairness? Because now the neck has to come into our round.
I don't think we've provided an unfair interpretation of the resolution. By saying that a UBI should be implemented for society due to AI automation,
So
we have proven the dangers, and you have agreed to them of the dangers
But
of AI automation, and we have said that a UBI can be applicable, as our 12 case studies prove that it is applicable.
all right,
in
so
different
let me
countries.
show you one example that you brought up. And that you also mentioned. You said that what a dollar looks like in Kenya is vastly different from what a dollar looks like in America.
Yes.
How is the neck supposed? So is the neck supposed to account for how a dollar looks like, or what a UBI would look like in every single country in order to come and debate the app?
I'm not going to tell the NEG how to argue.
So how should that is how our grounds isn't that so we're limited because we have to depend on we don't have any there's no limitations on the act round. Like it's just like this ever expanding.
Because that is what the resolution pertains to. We're talking about society as a whole, and with
Okay.
society as a whole, we are trying to find a solution
So-
to AI displacement for
Alright.
society as a whole.
We'll address this specific point. We brought up a specific part by Cynthia Eslam, that's an NYU professor, that says for any UBI to be specific, she actually did tack a number onto how much money would need to provide to a citizen to be effective, and that was $1,000. You never brought up any counter example, gave any reason why we should disagree with that number. If it is the case that a UBI to be accepted for $1,000, and we show in all of our
So I would first ask, first of all, in response to that, I would ask, what is the metric of that person's UBI? What is the purpose of that UBI that person is going for?
What do
The
you
purpose
mean?
of me and my partner's UBI, as defined by our definition, is
Yeah.
to secure the basic standard of living.
Okay,
Now,
yes, and-
securing the basic standard of living looks drastically different in a variety of countries, and I think it is illogical and irreasonable to say that $1,000, 1,000 USD is going to secure the same thing for somebody in the United States than
Well,
it is in a country like Afghanistan.
Judge, well, that does two things. First of all, that shows how overbearing it is on the app, like exactly what they're talking about. Now they're saying that any figure that we try to tack on to the UBI to
Do
understand
you have
it.
questions for me, or are you going to
Okay.
just do a contention and cross?
Okay, so let's move on. We'll go on to the contradiction that you noted. You said that how because we agree that UBI is a problem, and we
agree
raised
that AI is a problem.
that AI is a problem. Can you explain how it's a contradiction to say yes, it's a problem, but and we have a solution for it, but it's not a drastic solution. It's not a drastic.
I was
problem.
pointing out in your very first contention, and you can bring
How-
this up in
yeah.
later rounds. You talked about the sheer scale that we are overstating this problem, and that you like are trying to instill just the concern that we are trying to address a problem that doesn't actually exist. That's like one of the main points of your first contention.
We never said
So I
it was a
pointed out-
problem that didn't exist.
I said that's kind of the value or just feeling that you're trying to incorporate into that first contention. And then I was pointing out the contradiction by saying, if it's not that much of a problem, why are you so ardent on
Providing a
proposing a
solution.
counter solution in your fourth contention? Just pointing out the simple contradiction there.
That's okay. I'll ask what the definition of contradiction is, but that's time.
Just for a bit of a roadmap, I'll do the off-case stuff, move on to on-case stuff in order, just so everyone's aware. Is everybody ready to go? All right.
So the first thing I want to discuss is just the idea of exactly what we're specifying with this debate. So UBI policies vary greatly. There's not one single UBI. We're all agreeing on that. So the affirmative must spell out the details for this to be a meaningful debate, as opposed to just kind of vaguely giving an idea and making it so that we can't justifiably come up with an argument because it's all vague, and if we give any data, they just go, well, that's not the argument that we're going for. Notre, a Stanford philosophy professor, wrote that a number of procedures vary from one UBI to the next, in the funding source, the level of payment, and the policy package that comes with it. And so because of that, we have to try to at least come up with even some range to come up with that. And we actually did come up with a range, at least for the United States, which was that Cynthia Espen card that found that for a UBI to be successful at any level, to prevent poverty, to increase income equality, you would need to pay at least each individual person $1,000 a month. And that really hasn't been disagreed with upon. Now, moving on to our first discussion, which is the idea that the UBI will harm the economy. So I want to bring up the idea of that higher taxes or debt have to pay for the UBI, and that will harm the economy. Roberts wrote in 2026 that a national UBI program large enough to offset displacement would require trillions of dollars annually. That would either require higher taxes, debt expansion, or both. Higher taxes reduce investment incentives, while increased debt raises interest costs and crowds out private capital. Neither path supports long-term prosperity. And the impact of that is that economic decline needs to take over by radical leaders, which is outbreak of trade wars and great power war with China. That was a White de Gaulle from 2024 writes that economic stagnation and decline will be a catalyst for major conflicts. The economy could fuel political radicalism, protectionism, and nationalism that could turn into a military conflict. If economic growth is slow, tensions between the US and China could bring these two giants into a great power conflict. Now, that's the reason as to why hurting the economy through increasing taxes or increasing the deficit has that impact. The next thing I want to talk about is the counterplan. And the counterplan, the UBI will erode job skills by detaching workers from the labor market, while the counterplan solves better by directly promoting skills training. That was Roberts in 2026 wrote that UBI, by separating income from work, overtime, workforce detachment, erodes skills decay, and re-entry into employment becomes increasingly complex. This showed up repeatedly in pilot programs. UBI sidesteps workforce training, retraining, skills development, employer-based training. These tools do not address displacement directly, while UBI displaces directly, while UBI does not. And we also want to bring up the idea that in that Sam Altman study, who is an individual who was highly invested, it made it abundantly clear he is pro-universal basic income, that it was not successful. He tried to give 1,000 people $1,000 a month versus people $50 a month, and it did not increase education, it didn't increase business investment, it did not increase people to find better jobs, and it reduced their work time by 4 to 5%. That's an exact study that occurred, and on top of that, our Roberts study from 2026 found that in Finland, in Kenya, and in other countries, it did not translate to long-term higher employment, improved skills, and long-term income growth. There was, at the very shortly, just a small amount, but not a long-term effects on it. Now, moving on a bit to the on-case stuff, they bring up this idea of how our first point and our fourth point seem contradictory. What we're saying is that the risks of AI taking jobs aren't as significant and are drastically overrepresented. However, even if that is the case, and if we lose that argument, we still have the counterplan, which works better and is more successful. Now, but moving on to the idea that the issues are exaggerated. The Goldman Sachs study that they brought up exaggerates job losses by undercounting new job creation by AI. That's Lichtenberg 2026 says that the Goldman estimates do not fully capture the offsetting hiring surge tied to AI infrastructure in data centers, power systems, construction, nor does it fully account for the incremental labor demand generated by AI-driven productivity gains that lower costs and expand the markets. On top of that, they also failed to bring up the idea that losses from AI account for just 4.5% of all the total losses in America alone. They've completely neglected that fact, and that goes to show that the losses are being drastically overrated and oversteered upon. Now, their pilot programs that they don't prove their efficacy. US UBI pilots do not prove long-term benefits to health, jobs, or reduce inequality. The UBI pilots, such as Finland's and US city-level experiments, can reduce short-term financial stress, but impacts on long-term health, employment, and inequality need further assessment into further research. Next, UBI will not solve for job displacement. UBI will not improve job skills, job mobility, or increase in productivity. That's Roberts from 2026 says that UBI to offset the impacts of AI, the evidence doesn't support this. UBI experiments found that short-term relief did not translate into higher employment, improved skills, or long-term income growth. Cash transfers temporarily increased consumption, but did not raise productivity, increase labor force participation, or improve economic mobility. Next, they bring up this idea of poverty. And as we've already agreed upon, the only way to be successful in America is to have $1,000 a month. That was what our card read. And $1,000 a month is not enough to keep people out of poverty. Porter writes in 2025 that the prescription still falls flat. UBI, ask a truck driver to live on $1,000 a month. Two-parent, two-kid family would be pretty deep underwater, living on less than 25% needed to poke through the poverty line. We gave that number because that was the only number that's been given in this debate for what is necessary, for example, such as a country like the United States to be successful. We haven't given any other numbers. And then the idea of income inequality. They say it solves income inequality. However, the NBER study concludes UBI did not reduce income inequality and results in fewer hours worked. Matthews in 2025 writes that UBI programs have a dubious record. As a National Bureau of Economic Research paper demonstrates, the funds aren't enough to reduce income inequality, especially since participants tend to work fewer hours. And because of that, there were no real benefits to UBI and a ton of downsides. That's my time.
Hold on, 4 minutes set on our timer. If everyone is ready. Thank you for a very good speech. You talked about how, you talked very briefly about a great power conflict due to rising taxes, correct?
We bring up this idea that significantly hurting the economy in long-term ways
But
is
so,
going to
you
lead to that.
said hurting the economy as in raise taxes, correct?
Well, it was specifically due to increases in spending was the bigger issue.
Okay, so increases in spending and raise taxes. Are there not both issues I brought up from the quote I cited from the Pew Research Institute about what your counterplan would require, about raise taxes and increase spending that both have possible
Well, the
detrimental
impact
effects?
on it is that our counterplan, the way it's successful, is that not only it incentivizes companies to educate and retrain their workers. And what this would do is have a long-term benefit on the economy.
But the other
because there's
source
an
I cited that this doesn't incentivize them at all, that they would rehire these people regardless of the credit. So what would you say in response
The
to
difference
that?
to that is, as the opposition has already stated, there are some tax credits that exist, but the difference of our counterplan is it increases the tax deduction by 100%. That incredible of a tax deduction would have.
Do you have evidence saying that 100% tax deduction is going to stop people from rehiring workers they would have rehired regardless?
What we're saying is that it's going to. I don't have exact evidence off my head, but what I'm saying is that drastic.
I'm just saying you point in your first contention in an attack on our case, you talk a lot about it's simply coincidence that we see these statistics rising. For you cite unemployment. I'm saying to counter, do you have evidence to prove it's not coincidence that this rehiring due to a tax credit is not just what would have already happened?
In what? Due to what? What would cause the rehiring in general?
I cited the source that says it happens. I don't need to prove. I'm asking for your proof that it.
What we're saying is that the risks of AI in the long term, not just at this exact moment, but over the long term, the risks of that are curbed when there is that huge economic incentive for these companies to rehire their workers.
Okay, so further on, you cite Mr. Sam Altman consistently. Who is Sam Altman? What is his credentials or credibility? You say he's an AI or a UBI enthusiast. What is his credentials?
The impact of Sam Altman is that what Sam Altman did in that specific study is he's a huge enthusiast of
I'm asking
UBI.
for his
So
credentials,
what he did, he funded the study.
enthusiasm.
He funded the study. He was not the one who was responsible or anything. He's
Okay.
just the one who funded the study.
An
And
NGO
the reason why this is impactful is the fact that somebody who was
private companies can fund anything they want to say anything they want.
But this
I'm
is-
asking for his credentials, where he comes from, what his organization is.
this is a study
Prove
that
his credibility in
he's
today's
pro UBI, and because he's pro
That's
UBI,
really
and that study was negating the impacts of
We
UBI.
have proven multiple
shows
times that
it's not
UBI is a diverse and multifaceted issue. I want to know his credentials and his motivation for researching a UBI to make sure that it aligns with the affirmative side, what our vision of a UBI core aligns with. Because if you classify that his findings are also what we were representing for a UBI, I need to see evidence of his credentials and his motivation. Do you have that?
What we have for specifically is the fact that Sam Altman is an enthusiast of.
Is he a professor, a
what
doctor,
matters?
anything?
What matters is he.
Okay, thank you.
What matters for that
We
is that he wanted this study to be successful.
So
and
you
it was
talk about
unsuccessful and
how
did not
people
benefit his cause.
cannot live on $1,000 a month. Where on the affirmative side did we say that UBI was the only source of livelihood or income for these people?
What we're saying is that for a UBI to be successful, which is what our study said, and the only number that was given in this entire
in your
debate.
last speech, you specifically said that people cannot live on $1,000 a month. Where in the affirmative side did we say people will only live on
That's
their UBI?
not
They
what we said.
stop to work.
What we said specifically was that for UBI to be successful, which was that Cynthia Estlin card, for UBI to have any success in solving job displacement by UBI, the UBI would need to provide recipients with at least $1,000.
And that's specifically for job displacement individuals.
Yes, specifically
Okay,
for
thank you.
job
For job
displacement
displacement
by
individuals.
AI.
So what about people that are simply just living in poverty, already working? Would a UBI not help them?
But our discussion is about the overall discussion of the debate was about the UBI as a way to curb job displacement by AI.
Indeed, but we're talking about how
specific
you've also brought up how this affects the entire economy. So you do not have any evidence that states that this is, that we said we were going to live on $1,000 a month no matter what, because you're putting that burden on us when we did not state that ourselves.
The reason why I brought up is that the only number that was given to
That's
this debate was $1,000 a month for a successful UBI.
good.
Start my time now. In this speech, I will go straight down the flow to show why affirmative stands and UBI is a necessary policy solution. In response to our first contention that AI breaks the labor economy, they explain that this risk is overstated. While they acknowledge it is a problem, they disagree on the scale. We see AI automation is not minimal. My partner cites 16,000 people are losing their job per month due to AI automation. Prestani 2025 finds that 23.5% of US companies have already replaced their workers with ChatGPT, and we see no reason that they should be rehired. And in case we tell you that 300 million jobs are at risk of being automated, and people are at risk of losing these jobs. Although automation makes up 4.5% of job loss today, this amount stands to increase as we read that 300 million stands to be replaced. On our second point about how UI mitigates job loss, they turn this and say UBI is a poor solution because people simply bank their cash and reduce their work. However, we tell you that people invest their cash in case, as seen in the increase in educational attainment and investment in entrepreneurial ventures. Further, we do not see impacts in the labor force. University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy finds in 2018 that new research suggests that a universal basic income would not cause people to leave the workforce. The National Bureau of Economic Research furthers that they concluded unconditional cash transfers had no significant effect on employment, and it even increased part-time work. Our third contention discusses how UBI fights poverty. Our opponents do not engage with our evidence from meta-analyses from numerous case studies around the world to show that poverty is reduced. UBI is a structural solution to poverty. It changes the labor market, it creates access to education and better jobs. They had nothing to say when we explained in case that UBI creates better jobs because people have greater bargaining power. Furthermore, they do not engage with the evidence of a model proposed by the University of York that highlights significant poverty reductions. My opponent's third contention contrasts this by discussing how the economy is destroyed. Our opponents want us to provide examples and numbers and claim that they are the only side to give a comprehensive overview of the economic impact. But the affirmative side is not being vague. We show data on our side that shows dozens of cases in which that poverty is reduced, and we see in various countries from Iran to Kenya to Finland that we are reducing poverty, whereas the negative argument and evidence is US-centric. They only focus on the United States, and this resolution is calling for a societal debate. If the ACC wanted us to debate over the US, it would say the United States federal government should. But it says society, and the affirmative side is the only side to examine numerous case studies, favor our arguments on scope. They then discuss the reduction of welfare programs because of funding needed for UBI, but as we cite, these policies are not mutually exclusive. Further, on their economic concern, they cite inflation as a possible impact, but Stanford Basic Income Lab in 2020 finds that most economists do not share the hypothetical concern that a UBI would cause high and general inflation, because there is no reason to assume that a UBI could not be financed by taxes and dividends, which would use money already in circulation rather than newly printed money, which is exactly what my partner talks about. We talk about how theoretically, if we wanted to provide a funding mechanism, this could look different on country to country. If we really want to go with their world of the United States, we could fund this through taxes, and we see that this would not cause this inflation. Egger et al. 2020 furthers that a one-time cash grant of US dollars to villagers in Kenya amounted to over 15% of local GDP increase and had a minimal effect on the prices of goods in general. This inflationary concern they cite is simply not viable. Furthermore, in furthering the evidence that my partner read about the dozens of case studies, we see that we do not need to provide a specific number that the UBI would be giving people, because in practice, people in Iran under their UBI, they receive $7 a month. People in Kenya receive $22 a month. But the conclusion is that even though this dollar amount varies and we don't have to stick to their $1,000 for everybody, the overwhelming evidence is that we see benefits from these programs. No matter how much money they're getting, it is dependent on context, which the affirmative side is the only side to take a contextual-based policy and implement it in a way that is correct for each society. They do not address our fourth contention on how economic investment is promoted, where we give you numbers showing that people increase small businesses. They are empowered to start these businesses, especially for minorities and women. And then furthermore, De Pañas et al. In 2020, as I cited, concludes that UBI programs to a great extent improve individual, family, and general conditions of the economy. Our UBI program beats out their counterplan of tax deductions because UBI does not allow people to fall through the cracks. We are not targeting this assistance in any sort of way. There's no bureaucracy involved. We can simply target everybody instead of just implementing a complex tax deduction program. My opponents like to support their entire argument on Sam Altman's basis that UBI isn't working. However, they keep saying that Sam Altman's just a AI enthusiast. They provide no credible background for him. But what we do see is no matter what Sam Altman says, the studies he conducts are from open research. And the open research studies are the ones that we are citing in case. The very studies that Sam Altman is conducting shows that there is a 34% increase in entrepreneurial undertakings and that people are going to get more educated. So either you buy the fact that Sam Altman is saying that UBI is like terrible, or you buy our evidence from his company that shows that we are actually seeing these increases. Our opponents try to make this round seem unfair, but we provided open definitions for interpretation. The negative interprets it on a US-centric frame, but we are concerned with all of society. Affirmative solves for everybody. Thank you.
We're gonna be using chicken out the rest. Alrighty, is everybody all ready to go? Sweet.
Judge, this round should be judged upon in one key factor. If we want to get over whether or not universal basic income should be used upon and applied to vast groups of the population. Now, the reason why we disagree on the exact definitions we give you has to do with the fact of our initial idea that UBI policies vary so greatly. There is not one specific UBI, so the affirmative has to spell out at least some of the details. They don't have to give us an exact amount of money, but all we're asking for is at least some amount of money to debate against. Now, the reason why we bring this up is that for a successful and educational debate, numbers are beneficial. If we can't debate the actual numbers of it, of whether or not it can be successful, then it's not going to be a beneficial debate for anyone involved. No one's really going to get any education out of the system. And what we did is we gave a number, at least specifically for the United States. Now, the reason we gave this number specifically for $1,000 is that Cynthia Eastland said that for UBI to have any success in solving for job displacement by AI, which is the exact framing of this entire debate, the amount of money needs to be $1,000 per month. But on top of that, when it comes to the actual efficacy of the universal basic income, we have also provided the studies as our Lance Roberts card from 2026 card that talked about the Finland, Kenya, and other country studies. Now, the disagreement we have is that in the short term, as we agreed upon, there was small amounts of success for higher amounts of income, higher amounts of education. But in the long term, year upon year, as we made it abundantly clear, there was no long-term effects on it. What it did is it didn't provide really any impact on the long-term economy of the country. And the reason why is because UBI experiments found short-term does not translate to long-term high employment, improvement of skills, or long-term income growth. Cash transfers temporarily increased consumption, but did not raise productivity, increase labor force participation, or improve economic mobility. Now, moving on to the economic impact of it. So our opponent said, hey, we don't have to provide the deficit, we can just use the taxes. That is the exact words of the opponent. Now, as we've already said, our Roberts 26 card, higher taxes or debt to pay for universal basic income will harm the economy. As our data said, a national UBI program large enough to offset AI-driven replacement would require trillions of dollars annually, would either require higher taxes, debt expansion, or both. Higher taxes reduce investment incentives, while increased debt raises increased costs and crowds out private capital. Neither path supports long-term prosperity. The opponent said, yeah, we can just raise taxes, and that directly harms the economy. They did not refute that. And the impact of an economic decline is that our why to call 24 card. The economic decline leads to takeover by radical leaders, outbreak of trade wars, and a great power war with China. That was the card that showed that if there is economic decline, that would happen in this status quo with the introduction of universal basic income. This would lead to a US-China war and a great power conflict that could lead to thousands or millions of people dying. This would be the impact of an introduction to universal basic income. And that's the exact impact of what would occur if universal basic income was introduced. And there's been no disagreement or debate upon this aspect. Now, moving on to some of on the on case, which discussed, for example, the ideas of universal basic income and the issues with unemployment. Now, the reason why this debate comes down to, and as our opponent has dropped, is the fact that only 4.5% of total job losses in the United States, for example, have to do with AI replacements. And on top of that, the Gartner study found that by 2027, companies will rehire 50% of workers who they laid off because AI capabilities don't match the AI promises. That debate hasn't been discussed at all. And on top of that, a new study from Gusto analyzing hiring data found that 7,700 small firms concluded AI is increasing jobs. Now, they bring up this idea that they brought up that Goldman Sachs study about how there's tens of thousands of people losing their jobs each month due to AI. But that Goldman Sachs study they brought up exaggerates job losses by underaccounting for new job creation by AI. That's that Lichtenberg 26 card, which they have failed to talk about how AI is creating even more jobs in the first place. And now moving on to the pilot programs. So they say Sam Altman, the study that he funded, doesn't matter, doesn't have anything to do with it. What this shows, and the reason why this debate and this study is impactful, has to do with the fact that Sam Altman is someone who wants to do everything in his power to make universal basic income be successful. But in that very study, it found that in the long term, there was no long-term evidence that they attempted to find better jobs, invest in education, or start a business. They used short-term data, but they did not use long-term data, and that's the reason why, on top of all that, they also reduced their work time by 4 to 5%. That's someone who wants to do everything in his power to get universal basic income to work and show data that it's successful, but even he couldn't show it was successful. On top of that, we also talked about several of these studies, such as the one in Finland, such as the one in Kenya, that found that while it works in the short term, it reduces financial stress, it doesn't have any long-term impacts on employment, health, and equality. And because of all that, it's been made abundantly clear that it's not successful. Now, overall, Judge, what matters in this debate is whether or not universal basic income should be introduced. What happens is, as this debate is made abundantly clear, if universal basic income is introduced, what will happen is it will harm the economy. Taxes will be increased, and if taxes are increased, this harms the economy. And if the economy is harmed, it will lead to a large-scale great power conflict with China, leading to millions of people dying. This is exactly what will occur if universal basic income occurs. And on top of that, it wouldn't provide any success because it has no impact on long-term employment rates, education rates, long-term social stability. It doesn't reduce income inequality. And because of all that, you must vote nay.
Thank you.